It's funny how, at some point, life just throws everything at you, and you're left wondering how you even got here. I hadn't expected things to spiral this way, but here I was, standing at the edge of what used to be my marriage, trying to figure out where to go next. It was a mess. It felt like I was slowly waking up from a dream I didn't want to have in the first place. I thought I knew what I wanted. I thought I had it all figured out, but in reality, I was just clinging to the comfort of routine, letting myself be distracted by the noise of day-to-day life. When Emma and I first started dating, it felt like everything was in its place. But when things started to shift, when she changed, when I changed, it was almost as if the universe was laughing at me. I kept telling myself, we'll work it out. It's just a phase. People go through stuff. I guess that's what you tell yourself when you're scared to confront what's right in front of you. That morning, I woke up and felt it. That cold realization that the life I had been clinging to was slipping through my fingers. I didn't want to admit it, but I had to. I hadn't really seen Emma in a long time. Not the way I used to. The way we used to look at each other, the way we connected, that was gone. It felt like I was living in a house with a stranger. Emma had become distant. It wasn't just that we stopped having fun. We barely spoke anymore. The small talk that used to fill the silence now felt like an obligation. She would walk around the house, and I couldn't help but notice how different everything felt. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. I remember one night, sitting across from her at the dinner table, her face illuminated by the soft light of the chandelier, and for a second, I didn't even recognize her. It was like looking at a photograph of someone I once knew. We didn't talk about it. Of course, we didn't. Talking about it was terrifying, and neither of us was ready for that conversation. So, we drifted. Slowly at first, like a boat being pulled by the current. But eventually, the current picked up speed, and suddenly, I was drowning. I spent a lot of time thinking about how things got to this point. There had been signs, obvious ones, and yet, I ignored them. Maybe I was afraid of what it would mean if I confronted them. Emma and I had always been so close, or at least, I thought we were. But somewhere between late-night talks and long weekends in the mountains, something changed. I could feel it, but I didn't want to acknowledge it. Because what did it mean for me if everything we had was just gone? The tipping point came a few weeks ago, after one of our many, awkward, we-should-talk conversations. We were sitting on the couch and I asked her, "Are you happy?" It was a simple question, but I could see the panic flash in her eyes. For a moment, it felt like she was going to tell me the truth. She opened her mouth but then closed it again, like she was trying to protect me from something, or maybe from herself. She wasn't ready. I wasn't ready either. But the truth hung between us, thick like smoke, and we both knew it. I wish I could say I handled it well, but the truth is, I didn't. I tried to fill the silence with distractions, work, anything to avoid facing what was happening. We went on like that for weeks. She would go to her job, I would go to mine, and we'd pass each other in the hallways, barely acknowledging each other's presence. I found myself resenting her, but I didn't know why. Maybe because she wasn't fighting for us anymore. Maybe because I was, and it hurt that she wasn't. That night, I sat in our living room, the low hum of the refrigerator the only sound between us. I could feel the distance growing, expanding like an invisible wall. Emma was on her phone, scrolling through something, and I couldn't help but notice how she looked at the screen. There was no warmth in her expression anymore, just detachment. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to ask her what happened to us. But I didn't. Instead, I just sat there, numb. It wasn't until later, after she went to bed, that I realized I had been holding my breath the whole time. The realization hit me hard. I was suffocating, but I didn't know how to breathe without her. I didn't know who I was anymore, not without her beside me. I had lost myself in this marriage, in the routine, in the hope that things would eventually get better. But there was no magic fix. No one was coming to save us. I tried to talk to Amanda about it, my sister. She was always the person I could turn to when things went south, the one person who could see me for who I really was, not the version I showed the world. But even talking to her felt different now. She knew I was in pain, but she didn't know how to help me fix it. Amanda was always good at giving advice. She had this way of making you feel like everything was going to be okay, even when it wasn't. But I could tell she was frustrated with me, too. Maybe she didn't get it. Maybe I didn't want to get it myself. I didn't know what to do next. The logical part of my brain told me to leave, to finally face the truth and walk away. But the emotional part of me was clinging to the idea that this was just a rough patch, that things would get better if I just tried hard enough. I wasn't ready to let go. And then there was that nagging feeling in the back of my mind. What if this was it? What if this was the end? I tried to ignore it, to bury it beneath all the distractions. But deep down, I knew the truth. And the truth was that I had already lost her. I didn't realize how much I was avoiding the truth until the next weekend. It started like any other Saturday. Me, half distracted, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee, and Emma quietly moving around the house. She didn't seem to notice that I was staring at her, studying her the way you might look at an unfamiliar painting, wondering when it stopped making sense. I tried to shake the thought. I wasn't ready to dive into that again. I wasn't ready to confront what was slowly eating away at us. So, I did what I always did, filled the space with noise. I started talking about something random, like the weather or an article I had read. It didn't matter. I wasn't really listening to her response, and she wasn't listening to mine. At some point, she told me she was meeting a friend for lunch. And without thinking, I said, "Okay, have fun." That's how things had become, casual, almost mechanical. There was no trace of the closeness we used to share, no real connection. It's funny how, when things start falling apart, you try to keep up appearances. You tell yourself that you're not broken, that it's just a phase, that you're fine. But deep down, you know something is wrong. And as she walked out the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just about us. It was about me, too. I ended up spending the rest of the day alone. And somehow, it felt like a relief. It was like the silence was easier to bear than the tension in the air when she was home. I found myself sitting on the couch, watching TV but not really seeing it. My mind kept going back to that moment, the one where we both sat in the living room, pretending like everything was fine when neither of us believed it. The day passed quickly, and by the time Emma returned, I had convinced myself that maybe I had overreacted. Maybe I was being dramatic. But the moment she stepped through the door, I felt that nagging feeling creep up again. It was the same as before, this cold distance between us. She gave me a quick, half-hearted smile, and then went straight to the kitchen without saying much. I could feel it building, like a storm that was just waiting to break. I knew I had to say something, but I didn't know how. We had been here before, had these pointless conversations, and nothing ever changed. The idea of pushing her to talk again, of making her face what we both knew, felt exhausting. But it wasn't just about her anymore. I was suffocating in this relationship, and I didn't know how to breathe without it changing. That night, as we sat on the couch in near silence, I broke. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't pretend that everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. "Emma," I said, my voice cracking despite my best effort to sound calm. "We need to talk." She looked up from her phone, but it wasn't the look of someone who was ready to listen. She didn't respond immediately, just shifted slightly, like she was already preparing herself for whatever came next. That bothered me. It was like she had already built this emotional wall, this distance that was growing taller every day. "What's going on with us?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why are we like this?" She sighed, rubbing her forehead. For a split second, I thought she might break down, might finally admit everything I was too scared to say. But instead, she let out a long breath and said, "I don't know, Jason. I just don't know anymore." Her words hit me like a slap. I hadn't expected the answer to be so empty. It wasn't a fight. It wasn't an emotional outburst. It was just resignation. A soft surrender to something we both knew was falling apart, but neither of us wanted to fix. "I'm not happy," she continued, and those 3 words were like a knife in my chest. I wanted to say something back, to ask her why, to get her to explain, but I couldn't. I couldn't find the words. It felt like I had already been stabbed with the truth, and now I was just bleeding out slowly. I didn't want to look at her anymore. I didn't want to hear her say those things, but I needed to. I needed to understand why we had gotten to this point, why she had stopped fighting for us, and why I had too. "So what do we do?" I asked, almost as a reflex, my voice softer than I intended. She shook her head. I don't know, she said again. I just feel like we're stuck. The silence that followed was deafening. We both sat there, side by side, but miles apart. And in that moment, I realized something I hadn't let myself see before. We were done. Not just her and me, but everything. This relationship wasn't the same anymore. We weren't the same people who had fallen in love. We had changed. Both of us. And as much as I wanted to fight for it, part of me knew I had already given up. Maybe even before she had. That night, I didn't sleep much. I spent hours tossing and turning, my mind racing. There was so much I wanted to say, so much I needed to figure out. But I knew I couldn't do it alone. I needed to talk to someone. Someone who would see me for what I was, not just the version of myself I was trying to keep alive. The next morning, after Emma had already left for work, I called Amanda. I needed her. I needed to hear her voice, to feel some sense of clarity in all the chaos that had become my life. She picked up after a few rings, and I could hear the tiredness in her voice. Hey, what's up? She asked. I don't know how to do this anymore, I said, my voice almost breaking. I feel like I'm losing her, and I don't know if I even want to save it. There was a long pause, and I knew she was trying to figure out what to say. She wasn't one for sugarcoating things, and I needed that. I didn't need anyone to tell me everything would be okay, because I knew it wouldn't be. You need to decide what you want, Jason, she said finally. Do you want to fight for her? Or do you want to let go? Because you can't keep living like this. It's not fair to either of you. Her words hit harder than I expected, and I sat in silence for a while, staring out the window. Amanda was right. I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep ignoring the fact that I was slowly losing the person I loved. But I also didn't know how to let go. The next few days felt like they were stretching out forever. Every morning, I woke up next to Emma, but it felt like I was waking up to a stranger. She'd go through the motions of saying goodbye, but there was no real warmth behind it anymore. Just a cold, routine goodbye that didn't even feel like we were partners anymore. It was more like two people who had accidentally ended up in the same place and didn't know how to leave. I couldn't stop thinking about what Amanda had said. I couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when it was clearly not. And yet, every time I thought about ending things with Emma, a part of me froze. It was like I was paralyzed, unable to take that final step, even though I knew deep down that staying in this limbo wasn't doing either of us any good. I kept telling myself that if I just waited a little longer, maybe things would change. Maybe Emma would wake up, or maybe I would. But the truth was that the longer I stayed in this relationship, the more I lost sight of who I was. I was no longer the person I'd been when we first got together. I had become someone I barely recognized, unsure, sad, and constantly on edge. And the worst part was, Emma wasn't much different. We were both drifting, just waiting for something to happen. But nothing was happening. On Friday night, I made a decision. I was going to confront Emma. I had no idea how it would go, but I couldn't live like this anymore. We had to talk. We had to finally address what had been hanging in the air between us for months. She was already home when I walked through the door, her coat still on, her eyes glued to her phone. I could hear the low hum of the TV in the background, but she wasn't paying attention to it. She was too busy scrolling through whatever was on her screen. Hey, I said, trying to sound casual. We need to talk. She didn't even look up at first. About what? She replied, her voice distant, like she was already shutting down. I walked over to her and took a breath, trying to gather my thoughts. About us, I said. About everything. She finally glanced up, but there was no surprise in her face, no emotion at all. It was as if she had been expecting this conversation for a while, but had been avoiding it just as much as I had. Jason, what's the point? She said, her voice flat. We've been talking in circles for months now. I don't know what else there is to say. It hurt to hear her say that, to hear her talk like she was already giving up. But I wasn't ready to give up yet. I couldn't be. I'm not giving up, I said, my voice stronger now. But I need to know where we stand. We can't keep pretending like this is working when it's not. Emma put her phone down, finally meeting my eyes, but her gaze was cold. I don't know where we stand, Jason. I don't know where I stand anymore. Her words hit me harder than I expected. She sounded like she was already gone. Like there was no part of her left that cared enough to fight. It stung more than I could put into words. "I'm still here," I said quietly, my heart pounding, "and I'm not going to stop fighting for us, but I need to know if you're still here, too." Emma looked away, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. The silence between us felt heavy, suffocating. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, but I couldn't figure out if she was trying to come up with a response or just trying to avoid the truth. "I don't know, Jason," she said finally. "I don't know if I can do this anymore." Her words felt like a gut punch. I had been hoping for something different, for some sign that she still cared, that she was still willing to fight for us. But she had already made her decision. I could see it in her eyes. "We've been drifting for so long," she continued, her voice softer now, "and I don't even know if we can find our way back to where we were." The words hung in the air, and for a moment, I didn't know what to say. I wanted to yell, to scream at her to fight for us, to tell her that we could fix this. But I knew deep down that I couldn't force her to feel something she didn't. I couldn't make her love me if she didn't want to anymore. "I don't want to give up on us, Emma," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't keep doing this if you're not here with me. I can't keep pretending that everything's fine when it's not." She didn't respond right away. She just stared at her hands, her lips pressed together in a tight line. It was like she was weighing something in her mind, but whatever it was, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "I think I need some space," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to figure out what I want, Jason. And right now, I don't know if it's you." I nodded, even though her words felt like a dagger to my chest. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the answer I had been afraid of. She was giving up on us, and there was nothing I could do to change it. "Okay," I said, though it didn't feel okay. "I understand." I didn't want to understand. I didn't want to accept that this was the end, but deep down, I knew it was. We were too far gone to fix it now, and as much as I loved her, I couldn't keep holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. That night, I slept on the couch. I didn't want to be near her, didn't want to feel the weight of her indifference pressing down on me. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. How had it come to this? How had we ended up here? I had so many questions, but I already knew the answers. We had stopped trying. We had stopped loving each other, at least in the way we once had. And no matter how hard I tried to hold on, I couldn't bring her back. She was already gone. The days that followed were some of the hardest I've ever had to face. The apartment felt emptier than it ever had before, like the silence between us was louder than any noise could have been. Emma stayed in her room more, and I kept to the couch, only interacting when it was absolutely necessary. We both knew what was happening, but were too exhausted to fight it. It was like we were walking on the edge of something, not sure whether to jump or turn back, but both of us too drained to do anything about it. The idea of moving out hadn't crossed my mind, at least not yet. There was a part of me that still wanted to fix things, or at least give it one last try. But every time I looked at Emma, I saw the distance in her eyes, the same coldness that had been there when we had that conversation. It made me question if I was just clinging to an idea of her, an idea of us that no longer existed. Then came the night it all came to a head. I was sitting in the living room, trying to distract myself with some mindless TV show, when I heard her footsteps coming down the hallway. She was moving slowly, almost cautiously, like she wasn't sure what to say. When she stepped into the living room, she was holding a small suitcase in her hand. My stomach dropped instantly, and I knew what was coming before she even opened her mouth. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice quiet, almost too soft. I froze. I didn't know what to say. Part of me had been expecting this moment, but another part of me had been hoping it wouldn't come. Maybe I had thought I could still convince her, make things better somehow. But now, as I stood there, looking at her with that suitcase in her hand, I realized I had no idea what to say, how to stop it, or even if I wanted to anymore. "Emma," I started, but my voice cracked. I cleared my throat, trying to compose myself. "Are you sure about this? Is this really what you want?" She didn't hesitate, didn't even flinch. "I don't know what else to do, Jason," she said, looking down at the suitcase. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I don't think staying here is going to solve anything. I can't keep pretending I'm okay when I'm not. And I can't pretend we're okay when we're not. Her words hit me like a punch to the chest. I had always known she was unhappy, but hearing it like this, so final, felt like I was losing her all over again. The part of me that wanted to fix things, to tell her everything would be okay, was silenced by the reality in her eyes. There was no more pretending, no more hope left. I didn't want to let her go. I couldn't, but I knew deep down that if I tried to stop her, I'd just be holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. We were both lost in this relationship, and no amount of words or tears could change that. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice quieter than I wanted it to be. She didn't look at me as she zipped up the suitcase. "I'm going to my mom's place," she replied, her voice distant. "I just need some space. Some time to think." I nodded, though it felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. "I understand," I said, even though I wasn't sure if I did. "I don't want you to go, but if this is what you need." She looked at me then, her eyes softening just for a second. "But it was enough. I'll always care about you, Jason, but I think we both know this isn't working." The words didn't sting as much as they used to, but they still felt like a bitter pill. I wanted to argue, to fight back, but I knew better. I knew we had both already given up on this relationship a long time ago, and trying to force it now would only make things worse. "Take care of yourself, okay?" I said quietly, my throat tight. She didn't respond right away. She just grabbed her bag and made her way to the door. But just before she left, she turned around one last time. "I'm sorry," she whispered. And then, just like that, she was gone. I stood there in the quiet, the empty apartment, suddenly feeling even more suffocating. My head was spinning, my chest tight. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to fix what had been broken. I didn't know how to move on. The next few weeks were a blur. I stayed in the apartment for a while, trying to piece together the fragments of my life. I went to work, came home, tried to keep up with the routine, but nothing felt the same. I missed her, even though I knew it wasn't the same anymore. I missed the way things used to be, when we were happy and in love. But that was a long time ago. And now, I was left with the aftermath. I called Amanda a few days after Emma left. I needed to talk to someone, and I knew she'd been waiting for me to make that call. "You okay?" she asked when she picked up, her voice soft, like she already knew the answer. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what to do with myself now." Amanda sighed. "I'm sorry, Jason. I really am. But you'll get through this. You have to." "I don't know if I can," I admitted. "I don't know what's next for me. It feels like everything's falling apart." "It's okay to feel like that," she said gently. "But you don't have to figure everything out right now. Take it one day at a time." I didn't feel better after the call, but somehow, I felt less alone. Amanda always had a way of making me feel like things weren't as hopeless as they seemed, even when I couldn't see it myself. And so, I tried to take it one day at a time. It wasn't easy. I'd wake up some mornings and feel like I was suffocating under the weight of everything. Other days, I'd distract myself by working or hanging out with friends. But there was always that nagging emptiness, that feeling of something missing. I didn't know if I'd ever truly heal from this. I didn't know if I'd ever understand what had gone wrong between Emma and me. But one thing was clear. I had to keep moving forward. There was no other choice. I spent the next few weeks in a sort of limbo, neither moving forward nor backward, just existing. The days blurred together, each one feeling the same as the last. Work had become the only consistent part of my life, and even that started to feel like a distraction. I wasn't living anymore. I was just surviving. The silence in the apartment was suffocating. Every time I walked through the front door, the emptiness of it hit me like a wave. I couldn't even bring myself to go into the bedroom anymore. It felt like a place I wasn't supposed to be in, a reminder of everything that had been. I still had all of Emma's things there. The clothes she left behind, the pictures, the little trinkets she had scattered around. It was hard to know what to do with them, but even harder to ignore them. Every time I looked at something, I could almost hear her voice again, feel the weight of her presence. There were moments when I thought I could just box it all up, move on, let go of the past. But other times, I'd find myself staring at one of her old sweaters, thinking about how much it used to smell like her perfume, and I'd lose myself in the memories. It felt like I was trapped in this strange in-between place, somewhere between love and loss, but never quite able to let go of either. Amanda called me a few days after Emma left. I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk to her or not, but I picked up anyway. There was something about hearing her voice, even if it wasn't the same as hearing Emma's, that made the loneliness feel less unbearable. "How are you doing?" she asked gently. "I know it's been tough." "I'm surviving," I said, trying to sound more optimistic than I actually felt. "I'm not sure how much longer I can keep pretending that everything's fine, though." "You don't have to pretend with me," she said. "I can't imagine what you're going through right now, but you don't have to go through it alone. You have people who care about you." I nodded, even though I knew she couldn't see me. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do next. I thought I had everything figured out, but now I feel like I don't know who I am anymore. Like I've lost myself somewhere along the way." Amanda paused for a moment, and I could hear the empathy in her voice when she spoke again. "You're still you, Jason. You're just in the process of figuring things out. Don't rush it. You'll find your way." I didn't respond right away. The weight of her words hung in the air, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a glimmer of hope. I wasn't completely lost. I didn't need to have all the answers right now. "Thanks, Amanda," I finally said, my voice quieter now. "I appreciate you being here for me." She laughed softly. "Always." After that conversation, something shifted. It wasn't immediate, but I started making small changes. I began running again. I'd run in the mornings before work, sometimes for an hour, sometimes less, but it gave me a moment of clarity, just the rhythm of my feet hitting the pavement, my breath filling my lungs. It was the one thing that allowed me to stop thinking for a while, to just be present. I also started cleaning out the apartment. It felt like a monumental task, but I couldn't keep living in the same space that felt like a ghost town of memories. Slowly, over the course of a week, I started packing things away. Emma's clothes were the hardest to deal with, but I put them in a box, telling myself that I could donate them later. I didn't have the heart to throw them out, but it felt like the right thing to do, like closing a door on a chapter that had long since ended. It wasn't just about the physical space. I needed to clear the emotional clutter, too. I deleted the pictures of Emma and me from my phone. It wasn't about erasing her, but more about taking a step toward healing. I couldn't keep looking at photos of us smiling, acting like everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. One evening, after I'd packed away some of the last of her things, I sat on the couch, exhausted but strangely lighter. I felt like I had taken a small step forward, even if I couldn't fully explain it. It wasn't a solution to all my problems, but it was something. That night, as I lay in bed, I found myself thinking about the conversation I'd had with Amanda, about how she'd reminded me that I wasn't alone, that I didn't have to have everything figured out. I thought about how different my life had been even just 6 months ago, how I'd been so sure of Emma and me, so certain that we'd always be okay. But the thing about life is that it changes. People change. What we think we want at one point can quickly become something else. And sometimes, no matter how much we fight it, we have to let go. I realized then that maybe I wasn't as lost as I'd thought. Maybe I just needed time to find my footing again. I didn't know what the future held, and I didn't know if I'd ever find my way back to who I was before all this happened. But I knew that I had to keep moving. I had to keep going. And that was enough for now. A few months passed, and I kept moving, but not in the way I thought I would. I didn't exactly have an epiphany or some grand moment where everything fell into place, but I felt different. More like myself, if that makes sense. I wasn't fixed, but I was learning how to live with everything that had happened. I wasn't carrying the weight of it all on my shoulders anymore, not as heavily anyway. It wasn't easy. Some nights, I still lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about Emma, wondering where she was, what she was doing. Was she happy? Had she moved on the way I had to? I would tell myself not to go down that road, but my mind had a way of going there anyway. But slowly, those moments became less frequent. They didn't haunt me the way they used to. I'd started to go out more. Amanda was a big part of that. She had always been there for me, but it took me a while to see that she wasn't just a shoulder to cry on. She was someone who genuinely cared, someone I could talk to without feeling like I was burdening them. We had started hanging out more, just grabbing drinks, catching up, talking about whatever came to mind. There were no expectations, no pressure. It was just us. And then, one night, when we were at a bar, nothing fancy, just a dive with cheap beer and a jukebox, I caught her looking at me differently. Not like a friend, not like someone who was just worried about me. She was looking at me the way someone looks at someone they want more from. I'd noticed the way she smiled at me when I made a joke, or how her eyes would linger just a little too long when we were talking, but I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to believe that the woman who had been there through everything was now seeing me in a way I wasn't sure I was ready for. But that night, something shifted. There was a moment when she reached over and touched my arm, just for a second, but it felt charged, like we were both feeling something we hadn't been brave enough to acknowledge. I froze for a second, not sure what to say or do. I started, then stopped, not knowing how to put the words together. I wasn't sure if I should say anything at all. I didn't want to ruin the friendship, didn't want to make things weird. She smiled and tilted her head. "It's okay, Jason. You don't have to say anything." But I knew I had to. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, and ignoring it felt like the same kind of avoidance I'd spent months doing in my own life. "I don't know if I'm ready for anything, Amanda," I said quietly. "I don't want to mess this up." She looked at me for a moment, then shrugged. "You don't have to be ready. You're allowed to take your time. I just want you to know that I'm here, for whatever you need." And that was all I needed. I didn't have answers, but I knew I wasn't alone. I wasn't stuck in the past anymore, holding on to something that had slipped through my fingers. I was slowly building a new life, even if I couldn't see what it was going to look like just yet. The rest of the night was easy. No pressure. We talked, we laughed, and for the first time in a while, I felt like I could breathe again. A few weeks later, things had changed. Not drastically, but in a way that made me believe I could start over. Amanda and I didn't rush into anything. It wasn't about jumping into a new relationship or pretending that everything was suddenly fixed. It was about allowing things to unfold naturally. We started seeing each other more often, not in a let's define this kind of way, but in a way that felt right. She was patient with me, giving me space when I needed it, but never backing off. And I appreciated that more than I could say. The past wasn't gone, and it didn't need to be. But it was in the past, and that's where it needed to stay. I had learned that there were no perfect solutions to heartbreak, no magical fixes. Sometimes it just took time, and in that time, I'd learned to let go of the things I couldn't control. I wasn't the same person I had been when everything fell apart, and that was okay. One afternoon, Amanda and I were sitting in a small park, just talking, when she looked at me and said something that made everything feel full circle. "I think we're both just figuring it out, aren't we?" she said, a smile playing at the corner of her lips. I nodded. "Yeah, I think we are." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was actually looking forward to the future. I didn't know exactly what it would look like. I didn't know if Amanda and I would work out, if things would be different with me and Emma, if I would ever get back to the person I used to be. But that wasn't the point anymore. The point was that I was no longer stuck. I was moving forward, even if it was one step at a time. And that, for now, was enough.